cool. I just want to start with this very famous quote from Lucy Parsons: "Never be deceived that the rich will permit you to vote away their wealth." Lucy Parsons was quite an amazing activist in the anarchist communist community, and I think this is really quite important, that the change comes from struggle. It doesn't come from proposals. It doesn't come from things that would just simply work better if only everybody got on board. It comes from conflict and making things actually really happen. So we can kind of paraphrase that as never be deceived that the capitalists will permit us to code away their wealth, right? So when we're building like alternative platforms and thinking about alternative platforms, we need to understand that ours is a political challenge as well as a technical challenge. There's political forces that we have to understand and engage with. That it's not just a matter of how the code works, how the software works. We have to address both. So I'm Dmytri Kleiner from CounterAntiDisIntermediation, which is an arts collective based in Berlin, and we do work that investigates the political economy of information technologies. Sometimes I show some of the work, but I've only got 10 minutes, so no time for that. You'll have to find it out on your own. So we're going to go through a bit of the lexicon of CounterAntiDisIntermediation and how we address some of these issues, which is where these made-up words come from that the translator is going to hate me for. So to start off with, we'd like to start from the point of view of consent and thinking about consensual systems. There's a lot of talk about privacy these days and security and stuff like that, but actually what people really want is consent. It's not so much privacy that they want, it's they want to consent. Sometimes they may want to be very promiscuous in my information, but I want to be in charge. I want to be able to decide what I'm sharing with whom and when, right? And so the key feature that we need to think about is consent, not actually privacy and security directly, although consent requires privacy. We cannot engineer systems that can deliver consent unless those systems can be private as well, because they have to give me the choice of what I control. And privacy, as it turns out, and we'll explain this a little bit more, requires something that we've come to call CounterAntiDisIntermediation. You got time for the translation of that? CounterAntiDisIntermediation. And that itself requires venture communism. Because CounterAntiDisIntermediation requires creating systems that are not centrally controlled, where there's no ability for platforms to control user data and user interaction, which also prevents them from making profit. So in order to build such systems, we need other ways to build them that aren't based on the accumulation of profit, and we call this broadly venture communism. And venture communism itself requires transvestment, and transvestment we define as a transfer of value from one mode of production to another. So investment we think of as something that an investor can do that enriches both the investor and the mode of production that they're engaging in, right? Exvestment is something that may enrich the investor but does not enrich their mode of production, goes into another form of mode of production. And transvestment is the balance of those two, kind of like the balance of trade in an economy between import and export. So you can think of transvestment as import of value into the commons, right? And transvestment requires technological disobedience, because the industry as it is, all the stuff, all the equipment and things that are being produced by the industry are produced for the interests of capital and are produced for the capitalists. So in order to build systems that do something other than promote the interests of capitals, we have to use these systems in different ways, and we have to use them often longer than they were intended to be used, and in ways that are not the way they were intended to be used by industries that produce them. And in order to give us the space, the personal space to do this, we have to engage in what we call counterpolitics, which is engaging in existing institutions, defending rights, defending benefits, giving us the ability to create alternative forms. Right, so here's those funny terms again for the benefit of the translators. CounterAntiDisIntermediationism, venture communism, transvestment, technological disobedience, and counterpolitics. Right? So what do we mean by these? So disintermediation, in the 90s, some of you may remember, probably you and me here at least, we thought that everything would be disintermediated, that the internet meant a whole new era of society because we had finally a network that would enable us to communicate as peers. So everything was going to be disintermediated. We were going to not have banks and states and countries and things anymore. We were going to have distributed networks, peer-to-peer networks, commonses and things like that, that were going to completely replace all existing hierarchical, social, and territorially bounded institutions. But that didn't happen, right? even though we really thought it would. And the reason why it didn't happen was because, as it turns out, there's a lot of really powerful invested interests in maintaining these institutions and maintaining this sorts of mediation. And they successfully undertook a strategy of anti-disintermediation. So they, through applying their wealth and influence, were able to resist disintermediation, right? So now we can't merely talk about we can't really talk about disintermediation. We need to think about how to resist these strategies. So we need counter-anti-disintermediation. And one of the core principles of disintermediation is the end-to-end principle, right? So one of the things that was animating a lot of the excitement about the internet technology and why we were believing that this new platform would really change everything is because of the end-to-end principle. And the end-to-end principle means designing things in a way where all the functionality of the system resides in the end nodes, meaning your computer, the one actually right in front of you, and not anything in the middle. So no servers in the middle, nothing in the middle. Everything was supposed to be end-to-end. And this has a lot of really important engineering features. If you're going to design systems that are privacy respecting, censorship resisting, and scalable, they must be end-to-end. However, the anti-disintermediationists didn't think of it this way, right? Because profit requires centralization. For platforms to earn profit, they need to control user interaction and user data because that is what their business models are based upon, right? So centralized venture capitalist platforms emerged and started to replace the disintermediating platforms of the internet. So things like Usenet became replaced with things like Facebook, and other kinds of platforms emerged that were central. And the reason they emerged was not because they were better engineered or because they were more useful. Well, it's because they better served the interests of capital. They made it possible for capital to capture profit. Right, here's a quote from Hal Varian, the chief economist of Google, where he talks about the importance of lock-in. Right, so the basis of capitalist platforms is the capture of users, as Hal helpfully explains here. He wrote a book long before he joined Google, maybe even before Google existed, called Information Rules, which is very influential in anti-disintermediation thinking. Right? Let's just talk about that a little bit further. So, if you think about the business models of these central venture capitalist platforms, right? I think the previous panel kind of already talked about that a little bit, where the idea is that within media, it's not the media that's being sold. The media is not the product. The product is the audience of media, and the customer of media is not the person consuming the media, but the advertisers and such that are buying the audience. So when you're using Facebook, you're not Facebook's product. Facebook's product is advertising. It's an advertising platform. So their real customers, the people that are buying those advertising, and why they're buying advertising is because they want to advertise to you. So what they're buying is behavioral control, right? And so Facebook is selling you as its product or as its commodity. And commodities are always sold by grade and measure. Whether you're buying eggs or apples or milk, you're always buying a certain amount of a certain grade. So to sell commodity, you have to grade it, right? So an advertiser doesn't buy just 2,000 impressions. They buy 2,000 impressions from white males who have jobs and credit cards, right? So in order to grade their audience commodity, they have to spy on you. They have to provide surveillance in order to grade audience commodity to sell it. So this is why these kinds of platforms have to be centralized, because their business model is the sale of audience commodity, right? And so they need lock-in, right? So in order to kind of overcome these kinds of things, if we're trying to build alternative platforms, we can't build cargo-cult platforms. We can't say, hey, look, there's Facebook. Wouldn't it be great if we had a Facebook, but it's open source, or it doesn't sell your data, or or they cut you in, or it's like the same as Facebook but something else, right? We have to look much deeper than that, and how we design and engineer systems that are going to resist the anti-disintermediationists, because the federated groupware model, that was the original model of the internet. All right, so if federated groupware like Usenet or like Statusnet or like Diaspora, if that model was able to resist anti-disintermediation, it would already have. The strategy of anti-disintermediation was specifically designed to overcome those platforms. So they already defeated federated groupware. So federated groupware is not going to then come around and defeat them, right? So, and the reason that this kind of federated groupware doesn't really solve the problem is it doesn't address the fundamental problem, which is capitalism, right? The fundamental problem is capitalism, and I think you also mentioned that that if we're going to really build alternative systems, we need to think about how our productive capacities are spent, and like if we're building our communication capacity for social value or for profit. And of course, there's even a bigger problem, because when we're talking about technology and technological inputs, we have to understand this technological supply chain consists of colonialism, war, exploitation, and poison, right? So like anything that increases our use of technology is inherently environmentally, politically harmful. So this is another strong challenge that we have to address, is that every microchip is made out of blood. Right, so venture communism is, in very many ways, we talk about it like as if it's cooperatives, and it sounds very, very compatible, but there's a few kind of core things, right? So a venture commune needs to be federated, right? It needs to be built on transvestment. It needs to employ technological disobedience. It needs to build counter-anti-disintermediationist platforms, and that it needs to apply their economic power towards counter-politics, right? So cargo call platforms are impossible, right? Because because more users mean more resources. So the reason that federated groupware was so easily defeated by the theories of Halvarian and others was because even if you have many servers, even if you have a distributed federated sense, those servers still require upkeep. They require administrators, they require resources, so they cost money. And the more users they have, the more money they cost. So it actually makes it very difficult for these platforms to grow, because the servers require money, require resources, right? Whereas in end-to-end systems, right, end-to-end systems do not have a completely different scaling platform. So with an end-to-end system, the more users you have, the more capacity you have, because the actual systems are built based on the resources of the computers already in your possession. So you already have a computer right in front of you. It already has a CPU. It already has disk space. It already has RAM. It already has a network, right? And so when you're using end-to-end systems, truly distributed systems, then the scalability works completely differently than when you're working federated systems. And the most important difference is that every additional user makes the network resources grow, not drains them. Right? This is a very key difference to understand how a platform can scale. So when they're end-to-end, they become scalable and they become sustainable. So counter-anti-disintermediation means no servers, no admins. Right? So the system should not have any servers, and it should not have any administrators. The only software that should be running is the software that's running on your own computer, and everything in the middle should be networked ciphertext, and that's all. And the venture communism, the structure of the organizations that run these systems also need to have certain criteria, right? They obviously need to be cooperative, but they also need to be federated, because individual cooperatives can have power imbalances against each other, right? Can have power relationships among each other. So in order for cooperatives to really have a positive influence on distribution of wealth and power, they have to themselves be federated. They have to work together, and they have to share ownership of the key assets. So they have to be commons-based, right? So the productive assets have to be held in common, and they have to be open. So all workers that work on them have to be entitled to membership. They can't be allowed to themselves exploit outside labor, right? So the cooperative itself has to provide a path to ownership for all the people that it employs. Right, so investment, exvestment, transvestment, we covered that a bit in the beginning. So just to review that again, if you're looking at the economy as a macroeconomy, right? A lot of people kind of follow the sort of classical, you could say Leninist kind of like social trajectory of like, first we had feudalism, then the capitalists overthrew the feudalism, and then we had capitalism, and then sometime in the future the workers will rise up and overthrow the capitalists, and then they'll smash the bourgeois state, and they'll build the worker state, and then we'll have socialism, and then after a while social relationships will change, and the worker state will wither away, and then we'll have communism, right? You've seen variations of that kind of trajectory many times, but actually if you think in a macroeconomic sense, you understand that modes of productions are always happening. So every mode of production that's possible is happening, and they're happening at the same time. So we've always had feudalism, capitalism, communism, socialism, and every other mode of production that's imaginable always at the same time. So in our day-to-day lives right now, there are certain interactions, certain forms of producing and sharing that we do under capitalist terms, certain ones that we do under communist terms, certain ones that we do under socialist terms. And in the case of intellectual property and your apartment, feudalism is also alive and well and highly persisting, right? So you have to think multimodally. You have to think about what modes are happening and what's the structure of modes in the economy, not what mode do we only have, right? And if you think about it that way, then you can think of value going between modes in the same way that you think of trade going between countries. So you can think of export and import sort of modes. And what makes one mode grow relative to another is what we call transvestment. So investment is a form of investment of a player in a mode that benefits them and the mode and grows the mode. Exvestment is a form that may benefit them but goes outside the mode. So it grows a different mode. And transvestment is that balance, right? So here's a lovely illustration of transvestment going into the commons from the outside capitalist economy. And I think that's a very, very helpful way of understanding the transition. So when you think about revolutions, right, revolutions don't happen when one mode ends and another begins, right? Revolutions happen when one mode challenges the dominance of another mode, right? So the capitalists could not have become the dominant mode of production if they only invented capitalism after the bourgeois revolution, right? There had to be an existing capitalism in order for the bourgeois revolution to take place. And so thinking multimodally helps you understand that we have to build the commons movement, and we have to build kind of the worker state in the shell of the old, to use the terms of the IWW, right? So, and then back to technological disobedience. In doing this as technologists, we have to use technology in ways that are not necessarily following the interests of the industries and organizations that made them. So this term is coined by Ernesto Lorenzo. He's a Cuban artist, and he has a lovely body of work that he's collected the various ways that Cubans use technology, because in Cuba there's been an embargo for multiple decades, and so technology is very difficult to come by inside of Cuba. And so the Cubans have had to be very creative in how they use technology. So they use like parts of washing machines to fix like motors, and they use things in very different and interesting ways, right? And that are much longer and use them much longer than they were intended, right? And so we have to think that same way. We have to not, like, the real innovation is not at the front of the consumer electronic life cycle. Real innovation is not using whatever is being sold by Silicon Valley today. Real innovation is figuring out how to use the technology whose next stop is the recycling truck, right? Who's heading to the aftermarket, right? So this is the area where we need to focus on if we want to really build a large-scale sustainable movement, because we can't limit our movement to just the sort of like wealthy people that can own that can have the latest iPhones or whatever, right? We need to be able to focus innovation on the parts of the production cycle that are towards the end of the cycle. Equipment whose next stop is the recycling bin, because we don't want it to be recycled. There's a lot of value, a lot of wealth. Every single cell phone has a tremendous amount of human value invested in it. Like, there's been wars, environmental catastrophes, labor exploitation, and all sorts of other things that have made any cell phone exist. And to throw it away means that we've lost all that value that's already been created. And so it's much more radical to try to keep that into production than to be interested in what the latest thing being sold by the market is. So the enterprises within the commune must be technologically disobedient and counter-disintermediationist, or they will fail or be integrated with capitalism. And then the final thing, and possibly the most important thing, is that the venture commune must direct its economic power towards counter-politics, or it will fail to confront capitalism. One of the biggest weaknesses of the cooperative movement, besides not being federated, is that it's often apolitical. It often takes care of its own members, but doesn't actually use its economic power to fight for social justice more broadly for other workers, right? And so for it to make a real difference, it has to be able to direct the economic power it creates towards counter politics. And the reason I say counter politics and not politics proper is the distinction is that politics proper is this, again, more kind of Leninist idea of we'll take the state and from the power of the state we'll impose the new society from the top down, where I actually, I think that's a very questionable and probably impossible from the macroeconomic point of view to make happen, because that implies that there's some preformed thing that has the capacity to impose a new mode of production on society. If you think multimodally, then you understand that actually the new mode always emerges from the ground up, but only contests power when it's evolved to a certain point. So counterpolitics means confronting existing social institutions to protect social conditions. So supporting struggles to win and protect rights to health, housing, food, water, education, childcare, etc., because we need these conditions to build revolutionary alternatives. Our ability to experiment with different technologies, different communities, our ability to do other things is dependent on maintaining and protecting the conditions that we have as workers. So this sort of age-old conflict between reform and revolution, where there's an apparent conflict between people that want to reform the current society and people that want to build a completely new alternative society. This is kind of like an overly simplistic idea. It's a false dilemma, because actually we need to do both. We need to work on creating new bottom-up forms, while at the same time fighting in the existing institutions to protect our ability to do so, to protect the benefits and rights that we have. And I think that's it. Thank you.